Okay, welcome to the second part of the Flixel tutorial. So in the last tutorial, we actually left off with basically the shell of our game. And let's just take a look at what we created. So I have this menu screen. If I hit X, I can start the game, I can move my ship, and I can fire my bullets. So that's how far we got last time. Now obviously the next step is to add in our enemy and basically do some collision detection to determine when our bullets are actually hitting the enemy. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of my my main class called Invaders, I'm going to bump the frame rate up to 60. With Flixel, you can oftentimes get frame rates that high because, again, this is a blitted game. So you're going to want to experiment with the frame rate, but I'm going to put it up pretty high just based on my own tests here. It seems to work good. So now we've created our hero class last time, which contained the definition for our hero graphic and also contained the information about how to move the ship. Now the next step is to actually build our enemy class, which is going to be our class that represents our enemy ships. So I'm going to go into my project folder and I'm just going to create a new ActionScript class, and I'm going to call this enemy. And just like the hero one, this is going to subclass Flixel Sprite. And click Finish. So now inside of the exercise files for this version of the tutorial, I've included a new image called enemy.png. And this is actually a very simple sprite sheet that I created. So let's just take a look at that. And a sprite sheet is basically just a set of animated frames all inside of a single PNG file. And again, these are taken from the Galaga graphics that I found online. Now this is not a very beautiful animation, but you can see what happens here. The first frame is the regular ship, and then it starts to explode over time until the explosion kind of dies out. And there's also a blank frame here that we're going to show obviously when the animation is finished. So what we need to do is to include it here inside of our enemy class. Now we actually don't want to send it to the superconstructor like this because we're not using a simple graphic here. This is going to be an animated graphic. So all we're going to do is to remove that argument here. So let's first embed that image. So embed source is equal to, and it's enemy.png. Now we need to create a class for that. So I'm going to say private var, and I'll just call it enemy graphic. And that's going to be of type class. So now we're still going to send the X and the Y position to the superconstructor, but now we actually want to load in that animated sprite sheet animation. And to do that, we use the load graphic method here. The first thing we pass in is which graphics class we want to use. So that's enemy graphic. Now a Boolean whether or not this is animated, which it is, so we say true. Now this is a Boolean that says basically, do we want it to be able to reverse this animation? We're not going to need that here, so I'm going to say false. And now the important part here is the width and the height. Now this is not the width and the height of the entire graphic. This is the width and the height of a single frame inside of that graphic, which is actually 57 by 64. So again, that's the size of an individual frame, and then Flixel will do the work of determining, of actually pulling out those individual animation frames. So now that we've loaded this graphic, the next thing we want to do is to create an animation. So we can, and again, in a real game, in a big sprite sheet, you might have hundreds of frames, showing every type of animation this object can do. So we're going to use the add animation method. Now the first thing we pass in is a string, which is how we're going to reference it in Flixel. And we only have one animation in there, and it's just, I'm just going to call it explode. Now the next thing we do is to pass in an array of what frames from that sprite sheet that we want to use. So there's actually 6 frames in there. So we're just going to say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those first 6 frames actually make up our animation. Now the next thing we pass in is a number saying what is the frame rate in which we want to play this animation back. Now this is not, this is not the frame rate of our Swift. This is how fast should Flixel iterate through all these individual images. And this you should experiment with. I'm just going to do it at 15 frames per second. So it's actually going to go through each of those frames in the animation at a rate of 15 frames per second. Then the last thing is this a looping animation? And we're going to say false to that, because this is once the ship explodes, obviously, then it's done for, and we're not going to want to play it again because this thing is actually kind of dead. Well, not kind of dead; it's dead. So what we want to do with these enemies is we want them to be falling down from the top. So we're going to set the velocity.y property of these. Now I'm going to give it a little bit of randomness, so I don't want them all coming down at the same speed. So if we go to the Flixel U class, we have a method called random, which is kind of Flixel's version of random number. And I'm going to say Flixel random times 100 plus 40. So the lowest it's going to be for velocity is 40. The highest it could technically be is 140. Okay, so now they're all going to have this movement coming down. And just like we did in the hero class, we want to respond, we want to override the update function. And for right now, we're just going to do super.update, because again, we have to call that in order to get things to work. And all we want to do inside of here is basically say, if the Y position of our enemy is at the bottom of the screen, essentially off the screen, let's put it back at the top so it can come down again. And all we have to do to say that is if Y is greater than 600, which is the height of our game, then Y is equal to -20. We're just going to put it back at the very top out of the screen so that it can start coming down again. Again, these are very simplified game intelligence here. You're going to obviously, in a real game, you're going to want to spend more time and add a lot more logic to how these things are behaving. But for our purposes, this works. Okay, so now the last thing we want to do in here is basically when from our main state, we're going to play the explode animation when we determine a bullet has hit this enemy. But we want to play this entire animation before we actually kill the enemy graphic and get rid of it from memory. So the way in which we do that is we can add an animation callback, which is a function that gets called as our animation is happening. And then we can wait till the end of the animation to kill the actual object. So I'm going to call the add animation callback method, and now just give it a function to call. I'm just going to say onAnimate. Let's create that method. So inside of here, basically, there are 3 parameters that get sent. First is the name of the animation, because this is going to be called anytime anything is animating in this enemy. So if we wanted to determine the name of the animation, we can use that. The frame is sent next, which is a uint, basically, of the frame number. And then index is how many into the sprite sheet this current frame is. So all I'm going to do inside of here is to check if frame is equal to 5, then I'm just going to kill this object. So Flixel sprites all have a method called kill, which if you call that method, it will basically remove this entire